May 1940. Northern France was burning. The German army had crushed everything in its path. And now, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers stood trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. No escape, no cover, nowhere to run. The sea behind them, the Nazis in front. They waited for death as Stuka screamed overhead and tanks closed in for the kill. But then, something happened. The German armor, unstoppable until now, halted. Engines went silent. Orders came down. Stop the advance. Even Hitler's own generals were stunned. The British army was cornered. Victory was within reach. And yet, he let them go. That single command to stop at Dunkirk would become one of the most mysterious decisions in military history. A decision that changed the fate of the war and perhaps the fate of the world. When the German offensive began, few in the Allied command grasped how fast it would unfold. Hitler's army didn't crawl across France, it raced. Tanks cut through the Ardennes, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely, bursting into the open plains like a flood through a broken dam. By the time the Allies understood what was happening, it was already too late. The German spearheads had reached the Channel. In a matter of days, they had sliced the Allied forces in two, the French to the south, the British to the north, isolated and exposed. The plan that had once been hailed as unbreakable collapsed into chaos. Headquarters lost contact with entire divisions. Orders, contradicted orders. In villages across northern France, British troops fought rear guard actions to buy a few more hours for retreat and paid with their lives. As the enemy closed in, hundreds of thousands began moving toward Dunkirk, the last port still in Allied hands. The journey was a nightmare. Convoys jammed every road, trucks overturned, horse-drawn guns sank into mud. From the air came the constant shriek of Stuka dive bombers, their sirens designed to paralyze the soul. Before the bomb even hit, each explosion scattered soldiers and civilians alike into ditches and fields. By May 24th, the situation was beyond repair. To the south, French lines were breaking apart. To the north, the German armor pressed relentlessly toward the sea. There was nowhere left to run, only the narrow sands of Dunkirk, hemmed in by rising tides and German artillery. One British private later recalled, "You could hear the sea on one side and the guns on the other. There was no difference. Both meant death." It crossed the Channel in Whitehall. Maps were covered in red pins marking lost ground. Churchill stared at them in silence, realizing he might soon have to announce not just defeat, but annihilation. The trap was complete. An entire army, the pride of the empire, stood with its back to the water. And somewhere, behind the German lines, Hitler was about to make the most fateful decision of his war. The trap had closed. German armor stood poised to crush what remained of the Allied army. From Calais to Dunkirk, the British and French were pinned against the sea, exhausted, starving, surrounded. Victory was within reach, and then it stopped. On May 24th, 1940, as tank engines rumbled just miles from Dunkirk, a new order came down from high command. All armored divisions were to halt. No further advance, no explanation. The panzers, the unstoppable force that had shattered France, went silent. Engines cooled. Crews stared at one another in disbelief. They could see the Channel in the distance, the end of the road. And now, they were told to wait. Field Marshal von Rundstedt questioned the order. General Guderian protested. But the command came from the top, and that meant one man, Adolf Hitler. To his staff, the decision made no sense. The British were trapped, hundreds of thousands of men packed on open beaches, without heavy weapons, without air cover. Finish them now, they said, and the war would be over in weeks. But Hitler's mind was already elsewhere. He spoke of conserving tanks for the next phase, for the final drive into France. He spoke of marshy terrain near Dunkirk that might bog down his armor. And he listened, perhaps too closely, to Hermann Göring, the vain and ambitious head of the Luftwaffe, who promised that his bombers could finish the job alone. So the panzers waited. They waited while Göring's aircraft filled the skies. But then, the sea winds turned. Smoke and clouds rolled in, masking the targets. The British dug into the dunes, hiding beneath the haze. And in that brief pause, that strange, unplanned silence, destiny shifted. Across the channel, Churchill seized the moment. Operation Dynamo began. The Royal Navy, joined by fishermen, ferry captains, and civilians, prepared to cross the narrow sea. The decision to stop, whether born of arrogance, error, or fate, would echo through generations. Because in that hesitation, Britain found the time it needed to survive. The order went out quietly, but it carried the weight of nations. Operation Dynamo had begun. In the underground tunnels beneath Dover Castle, British officers stared at maps marked with red pins. Every hour, more men were trapped. Every minute mattered. If they failed, the British Army would cease to exist. The channel was narrow, just 39 miles of sea. But between Dunkirk and England stretched hell. German bombers ruled the skies. U-boats prowled the waters. And the beaches were a graveyard waiting to happen. And yet, they tried. The first ships, destroyers, minesweepers, trawlers, set out under cover of darkness. Their lights off, their decks silent, their crews whispering prayers into the wind. When dawn came, they found the beaches burning. Tens of thousands of men waited in endless lines, rifles slung over shoulders, faces black with smoke and exhaustion. They stood knee-deep in cold surf, staring toward the horizon, hoping for a miracle. Then, through the mist, the first silhouettes appeared. Boats, small ones, civilian ones, fishing boats, ferries, pleasure yachts, lifeboats. More than 800 of them, answering the call, piloted not by soldiers, but by teachers, merchants, old sailors, even teenagers. They braved the bombs and the fire, steering straight into chaos. When one boat went down, another turned to take its place. When one captain was killed, a deckhand took the helm. On the beaches, men wept as they climbed aboard. Some kissed the decks, others stared back at France, knowing they might never return. But they were going home, against every odd, through every flame. Day after day, the evacuation continued. The Luftwaffe bombed the harbor, strafed the beaches, turned the sand into inferno. Yet the line never broke. Men still boarded. Boats still came. By June 4th, when the final ships departed, more than 338,000 men had been rescued. An army, reborn from ashes. Churchill would later call it a miracle of deliverance. But for those who lived it, there was nothing miraculous about it. Only courage, chaos, and the will to survive. Dunkirk was not victory, it was escape. But in that escape lay something far greater. Because the men who returned to England would one day return again, across that same sea, not to flee, but to fight. They called it deliverance. But in the days after Dunkirk, deliverance felt like defeat. Beaches lay silent now, littered with helmets, rifles, burnt-out vehicles. The sea that had carried so many to safety was still washing bodies ashore. In the sky above, the smoke of battle still hung like a ghost. Britain had saved its army, but lost its allies. France was falling, Europe was burning, and the world waited for the next blow. In London, Churchill stood before Parliament, his face ashen from sleepless nights. He did not speak of victory, he spoke of survival. His words, carved in the weight of truth, echoed through history. Wars are not won by evacuations. The chamber fell silent, but then his voice rose again, defiant, unbroken. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender. The nation listened, in pubs, in bomb shelters, in quiet kitchens, where mothers waited for letters that would never come. For the first time in months, fear gave way to something else. Resolve. It crossed the channel. Hitler watched with a mix of triumph and frustration. He had destroyed France in weeks, crushed armies in days, yet Britain still stood. He believed they would sue for peace. He believed Churchill would yield. He was wrong. Factories began to roar again. Young men lined up to join the RAF. Posters went up across London. Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory. And above those words, the symbol of defiance, the V sign, began to spread like wildfire. But the storm was far from over. The Luftwaffe was preparing to strike, to bomb Britain into submission. Hitler called it Operation Sea Lion. If the Royal Air Force failed, invasion would follow. The fate of Britain and the free world would hang in the balance. The soldiers rescued from Dunkirk were still cleaning the sand from their boots when the sirens began to wail again. The next battle would not be fought on land, but in the skies above. And that is where our story continues. The soldiers of Dunkirk returned home, not as heroes, but as survivors. They had escaped one storm, but another was already gathering. Above the cliffs of Dover, across the gray English Channel, the Luftwaffe prepared to strike. Wave after wave of bombers, coming not for armies, but for cities, homes, and hearts. The battle for France was over. The battle for Britain was about to begin. Next time, we enter the skies, the day the Luftwaffe unleashed hell and the world held its breath to see if freedom would survive. If this story moved you, like this video, follow the channel. Because the fight isn't over yet. The next chapter decides everything.